All right, Hanson, you're in my spot. You didn't bring the wife with you, did you? Oh, it's a bit awkward now, isn't it? All right, I'll ask you guys to just move in. Save me having to project too much. But welcome to Sarah Island, or if you prefer the Parawa Aboriginal name, Langaranarene. Though for the 12 years it operated as a penal settlement for secondary offenders, it was officially known as Settlement Island. But you lot called it Devil's Island. You believed it was hell on earth, and it was feared by reputation. It was the first place established in the colonies for secondary banishment. So what that meant was you'd already done something deemed worthy of transportation, something quite petty no doubt, and if you played up either on the boat out or in one of the penal settlements of Hobart or New South Wales, you may just find yourselves for another boat and sent here. It was designed to break a man's recidivist spirit through hard labour, basically just ensure you're too exhausted to rebel. And for those of you who have read Marcus Clarke's novel For the Term of His Natural Life, you may believe you're familiar with this settlement, as it was based on this island. However, it is a novel, it is a work of fiction, and takes some artistic license. And if you do get stuck on Marcus Clarke's story and the actual bloodiness, brutality, and even the cannibalism associated with this place, you are left with a number of puzzles. And I shall present you with 7 puzzles today. And the first is here, the shipyards. Now, they never intended to build ships here on Sarah Island. They were initially using the convicts, you lot, as slave labour for harvesting Huon pine from up the Gordon River. The weather was often against them. They ended up with a stockpile of timber and began to build the ships here. 131 vessels built here in a 12-year period, making this the most productive shipyard in the colony. But that's why it's puzzle number 1. You can't build good ships with slave labour. Now, the smaller vessels are built and launched sideways from the small slip here. The larger vessels were built on a solid stock floor here, and it's still under the topsoil. It extends 30 metres in length, 8 metres wide, and half a metre in thickness. It is solid Huon pine, doesn't rot underground. And the largest vessel they built here was a 230-tonne bark, the William IV. But once the vessels were completed, they were then launched stern first, so that's backed out for you landlubbers. And we can see the slips here. So we can see 3 flattened blue gums to create a sliding rail to support the curved hull of the ship. A 2 metre wide gap in the middle for your keel run, and then another sliding rail. Goes on a gentle incline to 12 metres, and then that stick indicates where it drops into the deep water. If these large vessels needed any finishing touches, such as mast depth or rigging completed, they would then be brought straight in to a finishing dock, which I'll point out as we go past it. Now, before we move on from this spot, there's a few other things I wish to point out. If you look across the water, you can see a small island, which the convicts called Small Island. But it was also known as Grummet Rock or Condemned Island, and that is where they kept the hard men, the out and outers, the ones they couldn't keep here with the rest of the settlement for fear of being a bad influence. And these men would be brought across to work in chain gangs here on the island, either chained to each other in the quarry or in the mill, physically chained to the large capstan, when the rest of you had been transported to those work gangs on the mainland during the day. To the right of Grummet Rock, it's sadly under rain cloud at the moment, but that may burn off a little bit later. You can see the distinctive peak of Frenchman's Cap with a 300-metre sheer drop on one side. Looks like a shark fin. And by keeping Frenchman's Cap to his right, James Goodwin stayed out of the river systems to the south and made his way to Hobart by foot in a journey which took him just 6 weeks. Impressive going crashing through all that bush. However, he was recaptured near Ouse, just outside of Hobart. Oh, but they didn't send him back here. When it turns out he'd done such a sterling job, they grant him a pardon. and employed him in the Surveyor General's office. And the first job they gave him was to officially map out the Central Highlands he'd just passed through. First white man known to do it. By 1829, James Goodwin's escape route and another one further up the coast were well known to all the convicts. Yet those escape attempts, which averaged 1 in 5, 180 recorded escape attempts. That's a phenomenally high rate when you look at what you've got to contend with. But from 1829, those escape attempts fall to virtually nothing. Puzzle number 2. It's like you lot suddenly don't want to leave. Now, some of you left the island, but you didn't quite leave the settlement. And if you look across the water, line up these tree branches to make a little triangle, you can make out the pale cliff face of a tiny little island very close to the mainland. That is Halliday's Island, and that is Sarah Island's equivalent to Port Arthur's Isle of the Dead. 83 men buried out there, practically on top of each other, including George Rex, the convict constable who was brutally murdered by drowning on the convict condemned island there, Grummet Rock, in 1827. And also John Ollery, first man buried out there. He was sentenced to 50 goes of the lash, declared unresponsive on the 30th lash, and pronounced dead on the 35th. He still got his full sentence though. Yeah, now you see why some of you are so keen to risk it all to escape this place. And some of you got that glint in your eye like you want shot of it already. So I'm going to get you straight through the muster yard. Quick head count. Now I do appreciate a few people do have questions, but if I start fielding Q&A now, I won't get to cover lots of things. So bear with me, and hopefully I'll cover everything, and then if I don't, you can ask me questions later, but I think I'll probably cover most of the things you're curious about. So we've just walked past what were the blacksmith's forges. So those bricks you see, there were 4 running back into the bush, and then in the distance, and you'll see it as you walk back to the boat, is a large nail maker's forge for drawing out 2.5 metre long pins for rabbiting and scarfing the keels of the ship. So another indication that it was quite the hive of industry here. Now the first job the convicts had when they arrived was to chop down every piece of vegetation. And there's a number of reasons for that. It provided the space. Sarah Island is not particularly large, only 12.5 acres, and at the peak of the settlement there were 28 buildings here on the island. It also meant you didn't have to bring in all the building materials. A lot of these trees you see here, it's all natural regrowth, Tassie blackwood, fantastic timber. But also meant, bearing in mind the class of character we had on an island like this, with all the trees cut down, I don't have to keep my eye on you. I can see you lurking around near the foliage. Perfect spot from which to launch an ambush, isn't it? But of course, once they cut all the trees down, they realised it's not called the Roaring Forties for nothing. The winds will often whip through here. So they erected a windbreak fence the entire length of the island, 12 metres high at its highest point. It's quite the engineering feat. And you can see just the footers that remain of the windbreak fence again as you make your way back to the boat. Now the first Commandant, Lieutenant Cuthbertson, had his office built where this large blackwood now stands, who could observe the work of the day. That's where these hard men, these out and outers, ones from Grummet Rock, would be working in the quarry. Cuthbertson also had these stones from the quarry arranged in the form of a pulpit, and it was here that he would address the muster and also issue the disciplines. Now we've heard that they used the lash here, but the lash they used was the Macquarie Harbour cat. 3 cat o' 9 tails, 27 tails. They were lashed together. And not only that, but it was not only dipped in tar, but also picked with lead. It was a savage instrument, designed to open a man's back on the very first lash. The Macquarie Harbour cat was banned at Port Arthur and on Norfolk Island for being so inhumane. But here, it's used regularly. Even though Cuthbertson was a highly decorated cavalryman and had been one of Wellington's steelbacks in the Napoleonic Wars, here he's described as little more than a sadistic bully. And he's said to have drowned accidentally See, a vessel had slipped its moorings during a storm. Cuthbertson took his own boat out to render assistance, gone to trouble himself, ended up in the water, started to drown. He waved frantically to all the convicts on shore to come rescue him, and they all stood there and waved back. Now, I do have a small apology as I've somewhat misled you. I've already welcomed you to Sarah Island, though technically you've yet to set foot on the actual island. Everything we've walked along is reclaimed land. It has wharves, jetties, roadways, slipyards and the likes. As we head up to the next stop, you'll notice we're passing over a nice sort of gently undulating slope down to the water, but it was actually built to be a flat shelf. So this whole side of the island has been reclaimed what's called marine pigsty fashion. Heavy blue gum timbers, logs up to 60 tonne each, have been laid flat on the seabed parallel to the shore, up to 70 metres out. And then a series of 150 flattened blue gums have been spaced out to form a grid-like pattern. It's all filled in with rock and rubble, landfill, which is packed down, and that creates your solid flat work surface. However, being a platform, it is hollow underneath. So over time, the water has got in and it's lifted these top timbers. But if you look to the left, you'll see smaller sandstone blocks than this that have been placed by hand by the convicts to create a retaining wall to brace the original cliff face. You'll also see at the far end where the wall has been built as a dry stone wall. And once we get past this clump of trees, if you look to your right, you'll see that finishing dock that I mentioned a little earlier.